Welcome to the Mastermind webinar. My name is Wendell Hunter, and I am joined by my colleague, Giles Imrie. Giles is our legal counsel here at Mind Property Management. The reason for us having this webinar today, as many of you may or may not recall, we actually did a piece of content on this assembly bill, and it was actually one of our highest performing pieces of content. I mean, we had discussions from landlords, renters, everybody chimed in, and so we felt like, let's just dig a little bit deeper and let's actually have a webinar. This is going to be an interactive webinar. I am going to be leading the conversation. However, I want full participation. I want, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat. We will have a Q&A section at the end. Giles is an expert at legal counsel, so you guys are all in good hands. Awesome. So without further ado, let's get started. All right. So Assembly Bill 1482. Giles, what is this thing all about?
Yeah, thanks, Wendell. So this bill is, it's a statewide initiative. And it has two components. One is a rent cap, a statewide rent cap, and then the other component is what we call just cause. So those two pieces do have an impact, and as I said, it's statewide in the essence that if you don't have an existing rent control ordinance in one of your local markets that is even stricter than this, then this statewide initiative will apply to your rental home. There are some exemptions we can get into that exclude certain properties from the bill, which would exclude them from both the cap and the just cause ordinance.
Okay, when did it take effect, or when does it take effect?
So it was just signed. Governor Newsom just signed it in, I think, last week. So it is now official. It takes effect on January 1st. So as of January 1, assuming you don't qualify for one of the exemptions, you're now going to be subject to the rent cap, and any existing tenancies that you have are now under just cause, meaning you can't unilaterally terminate a lease at the end of its term if the tenant is otherwise in compliance with their lease.
Okay. Okay. Tell me about those exemptions. What gets me out of having to abide by the statewide rent control?
So there's the bill itself, or now it's going to be the civil code. So the bill basically, there's civil code sections that are now enacted as part of the bill. But in terms of the ones that our investors are most, you've got things like transient housing, hotels, school dormitories that are exempt. But the ones that are going to impact probably most of our customers or investors are if it's a new construction that has received a permit of occupancy within the last 15 years. It's a rolling 15 years. So if you've got a new building that has been just constructed, that is going to be exempt for 15 years.
Okay.
If you take a new building and redevelop it, where you get a new certificate of occupancy, that also would remove it from this bill for that same 15-year period. Single family homes are exempt, so alienable properties that are separate, provided that they are not owned by a real estate investment trust or a corporation or an LLC that is in turn owned by a corporation. So if you as an individual own a single family home in California, it is not subject to this bill.
So even if I own multiple homes, so like I could own 100 homes, and I would still be exempt, 100 single family homes?
Yeah, you look at the property, the individual property to determine if you're exempt, not the owner. So you're looking at each individual property to see if it is subject to this bill or not.
Okay, interesting. And why do you think why was this bill even brought about? Why do you think we even needed a bill like this? I mean, wasn't everything going just fine?
Well, this is as you know, probably a hot political item in California. So you've got certain tenant right groups that bring up rent control every single year. As most of you probably know, we had Prop 10 on the initiative last year that was shot down. That was an attempt to repeal our Costa-Hawkins Act, our existing Costa-Hawkins Act, which limits certain properties from rent control at the local jurisdictions or prevents local jurisdictions from designating certain properties under rent control. That was shot down, but tenant right groups have been doing this every year. So part of this bill is an attempted negotiation by various stakeholders. The California Apartment Association is a big stakeholder in this. And I think part of the hope was getting to a negotiated sort of rent cap like this, knowing that the legislature is going to move on it, trying to put something in place that's best of both of all evils, if you will. I think the hope was that it would be, this is a copycat bill of a bill that's already in Oregon. Oregon was the groundbreaker, so to speak. So they implemented a almost identical bill. The exception being theirs is 7% plus the CPI. And I think the California Apartment Association had negotiated to do the same thing, and in the last minute it was reduced to 5, which is unfortunate. But nonetheless, I think part of the hope here is that this will take some of the wind out of the sails of what is going to continue to come year after year from tenants' rights organizations in terms of trying to implement tighter and tighter rent control, either in the local markets or even statewide like this.
Interesting. Well, okay, couldn't, as a property owner, wouldn't I, if I knew that the bill was going to come on, couldn't I just raise my rents right now?
Yeah, you're essentially run out of time, but the bill does have a look back. So even though it goes into effect on January 1, just cause only goes into effect January 1. Rent increases as of January 1. They will look back to March 15th of 2019. So if you've increased your rent for over what you otherwise would have been able to under this bill, then you'll have to reset the rents effective January 1 to what you would have been allowed to do as of March 15th, 2019, if that makes sense.
I see.
So we're now mid-October. So presumably if you've got a tenant on a month-to-month lease, in order to increase their rents now, you'd have to give them a 60-day notice, most likely. You're already going to be right up against January 1 before that even goes into effect, and then you have to bring it back. This is all assuming you're increasing it more than the allowed amount under the cap.
Right.
7 and change.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, Okay, so property owners in general, I mean, how do you see this bill impacting, the property owners? I know, we have tons of owners here in California. They own single family, multifamily. How do you see this impacting those people?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's kind of a loaded question, but it impacts existing property owners, and then it also impacts investors that are looking to buy investment properties, right? So, from an existing owner standpoint that's already owns a property that is going to be subject to the rent cap and just cause, some of the things that you're going to have to take into account are, some of the unintended consequences. I know we're going to touch on this earlier, that, property owners aren't in the business of kicking out good tenants. And most of the property owners and investors that we know value good tenants over maximum rent. Meaning, you've got a good tenant that takes care of your property, pays their rent on time, chances are you're not raising or squeezing them like you otherwise would for somebody that is not a good tenant. The impact of this bill of putting a cap, the 5% cap, I'll call it 7% because it's 5% plus the cost of living index, which is usually between 2 and 3%. So let's for the sake of this, we'll just call it 7% per annum. It's a use it or lose it. So every year, if you don't increase 7%, you start anew on the next 12 months. So as a property owner, where I might otherwise be okay renting my unit for under market prices, even if it's slightly under market, if I've got a good tenant, I'm now incentivized of, hey, I've got to take this rent increase or I lose it. And if I go 5 years, I might otherwise 5 years with doing nominal rent increases with a good tenant, I'm all of a sudden going to be under market, and my hands are going to be tied in terms of what I can increase, if that makes sense. So that's one of the sort of negative impacts for an existing owner. One of the other things you'll want to do is take a hard look at your screening criteria. It's now, because of just cause, without just cause, you can enter into a 12-month lease. If things don't work out with a tenant for whatever reason, they're paying late habitually, they're a nuisance is probably the word, because there's an exception for a nuisance, but we'll say like minor nuisance that doesn't rise to the level of material breach.
Right.
Or they don't take care of the property. At the end of 12 months, you can decide, hey, we're gonna terminate the lease and move on. You can no longer do that under the just cause ordinance. So, long-winded way of saying you really want to take a hard look at your screening criteria. You may want to tighten your screening criteria. We do know that the tighter your screening criteria, you're going to get a higher caliber resident in terms of somebody that does pay their rent on time, takes care of the property. That's a little bit of stereotyping, but it does play out from various studies. So where you may have had a more lenient screening criteria, knowing that you can terminate if things don't work out, you're now stuck with this resident for an extended period of time. That could be 1 year, it could be 20 years. Obviously, tenants in San Francisco are there for a long time now. This is a little different because 7% is still a decent amount. You can increase your rents per annum, provided that you're not totally under market on a unit or a building.
Right. Right. Because if I'm a property owner, and I'm someone that, generally keeps my rents low, knowing that I'm gaining appreciation, because just so that I know, just because I know that in the future I won't be able to raise them or substantially raise them, it might make some property owners actually, raise rents more frequently, just because, it's
Absolutely.
kind of like use it or lose it.
A good example, somebody that may otherwise raise their rents 2% or 3%, just keeping up with inflation and the rising costs, are now all of a sudden we're gonna need to go to the 5% rent, just because it's a use it or lose it, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, yeah, yes. It's interesting because, um, although property owners have limits on how much they can go up, they're still not exempt from, just the cost of maintaining, the taxes, and everything that kind of goes into it. So, it just seems like property owners could be, the margin could start to get squeezed, more and more. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the same analysis. I mean, theoretically, your costs of maintenance and insurance costs and all of that should be in line with the sort of rise in the cost of living, and then you get 5% on that. So if you're unless you're starting from a really under market level, you should be able to keep up with that with the 7%.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. And this is all of California. I mean, I know, Bay Area, San Francisco, Bay Area is a lot different than, say, Fresno, or I don't know, Bakersfield. This impacts us all.
This impacts us all unless there's an existing rent control ordinance or initiative in your particular market, and this does not prevent cities from implementing their own rent control that have tighter criteria. So this is the groundwork statewide, but even in Fresno, there's nothing to stop the city of Fresno from implementing their own rent control, so to speak. I'd be surprised, but there's nothing to stop them from doing it. That had tighter restrictions than what's in this California Assembly bill, and then that would control. You're not subject to both. You're subject to the tighter of the two, the stricter of the two.
Interesting. Okay. What are your thoughts? I mean, how do you see this impacting renters? 'Cause I know in our world where, there's the property owners, and, we're trying to create happy homes and healthy investments. So we're always thinking about renters' well-being as well. How do you see this impacting renters?
I mean, personally, I view rent control as short-sighted. It does impact renters in the long term and have a negative impact. So it's a short-term fix that has negative consequences down the road. And when I say that, you you benefit theoretically incumbent renters, right, by providing them with some assurance that their rent's not going to increase more than 7%. Now, that being said, we just talked about how property owners are going to probably increase the rent more than they otherwise would. So that's counterintuitive to that argument. But we do know that the impact of rent control will result in less housing. And when I say less housing, property owners are now incentivized to take homes off the market, whether it be in San Francisco, we saw a lot of condo conversions and things. So I just read a recent study where they estimate that 15 to 20% of the housing stock since 1994 has been removed in San Francisco due to redevelopment or condo conversion. So that's a material number, and that impacts future residents. So while you may be benefiting incumbent renters by providing them some stability, by you're in essence going to be reducing the supply of housing over the long term for new renters, which, as we know, you reduce supply, you drive up prices. So new renters coming in are now going to be paying more than they otherwise would in a natural market because you've got a higher demand, and you've also got various factors, right? Potential reduced housing, which drives up prices. You've got landlords that now need to maximize the amount that they can get on that initial tenancy, right? Because that's your new baseline for every year thereafter in terms of your cap. And so that all drives up prices, and in essence, you're basically contributing to gentrification. And so by driving up prices, you're attracting a higher income resident. If a landlord or an investor decides to take a building off the market and redevelop it so that it's not subject to rent control, now all of a sudden when you put that back onto the market, it's been redeveloped. These are presumably much nicer units. They cost more. You're attracting a higher income resident than you had before, and you've got sort of this divide between the incumbent renters and higher income new renters that are paying a higher price. So new renters are paying for the benefits given by the incumbent renters, if that makes sense.
Wow. I mean, the more I hear this, I mean, being a father to two sons, I just can't help but think about how rough this is going to be on new college grads. I mean, if I'm graduating college, I mean, it's going to the amount of like affordable rent is going to be almost zero here in California.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other impacts we haven't really talked about is, and you see this more in San Francisco or Berkeley that have really tight rent caps, right? Their rent caps are much less. Those are 1 or 2% versus 7% in this bill. But in San Francisco, for example, we know that through various studies that over the last 20 years, rent control has reduced renter mobility, for lack of a better term, by 20%. So somebody that otherwise would have moved but for rent control is now either can't move or is significantly incentivized not to move because their rent is so far below market. Right? So somebody that used to work in San Francisco that now works in San Jose may be commuting to San Jose rather than moving down to San Jose because their rent is so good in San Francisco. So tenant advocates would argue that that's a good thing. We've got somebody in their place in San Francisco, but that's also a unit that would have been freed up for a new renter if they had moved to San Jose in a natural market.
Right. Yeah. It definitely seemed, I mean, I also think about, I mean, most renters, you rent with the intention this is just kind of on the positive side. Like if you rent and you're like, hey, I want to rent for a year to two because I want to save money so that I can purchase a home, at least it kind of fixes how much your rent could go up year to year. At least you can kind of plan for it, just kind of on the positive. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think somebody that's just staying for a year, the implications are more long term, I think, in terms of playing it out. One of the differences will be sort of investors that are looking at existing buildings Um, Today, a building that is significantly under market may be attractive to a new investor.
Right.
Because they're performers, they can figure out what the market rents are and what this
Right.
building will be worth over the long term. They're going to be going to pay a lot less for that same building today when they model this out in terms of when they can recover their investment over a period of time, to keep the rent cap in place.
Do you think it could potentially drive down pricing?
I'm sorry,
You know,
I think it'll
I
what?
said, I said, do you think that it could potentially drive down prices for, MF multifamily, like, duplexes and fourplexes and stuff like that? Just
Um, hard to
knowing
say.
that I can't get the rent that I could have gotten in the past.
It'll depend. So, a building that's substantially under market, obviously investors are going to be willing to pay less than they otherwise would in a free market with a
Yeah.
rent in place. But there's also going one of the other unintended consequences is now as an investor, I'll be looking at, at what point does it make sense for me to just take that building off the market, completely redevelop it, get maximum rents without now I'll have a building that's I can get premium rents, it's brand new, and it won't be
Right.
subject to control for 15 years. So where an investor may have otherwise just done a fix up, got good rents for a building, is now going to take it off the market completely, redevelop it, get a fresh certificate of occupancy, and they're going to attract a higher income resident and have 15 years to recoup their costs before it's subject to rent control again.
Okay, and that redevelopment, I know you kind of touched on it a little bit earlier. How is that like quantified? Like I have I have 4 units. Okay, I take it off the market, I fix it up. How is it quantified that like this has been renovated to a point to where it could be exempt?
Well, so we haven't really talked about some of the exemptions that are um, we're under the just cause. So this would be like a just cause exemption. So um, we barely touched on just cause, and maybe we should revisit. But
Yeah, let's talk about just cause. Yeah, tell us about just cause.
so the implication of just cause is, as I mentioned earlier, you can no longer, once the term is up, you can no longer terminate a tenancy as the landlord unless there's been a material breach of the lease, which would be residents not paying rent, or the civil code outlays. I think there's like 8 different reasons that are what they call at cause reasons that you could terminate a lease, and they're all basically material breach. Nuisance I mentioned earlier, but if somebody's committing a crime or cultivating illegal drugs in there, that would be something that you could terminate. Illegal subletting. These are all things that are typically would be a breach of your written lease agreement. But then there's no fault clauses, which means that you can justifiably terminate a tenancy even if a resident is otherwise in compliance with their lease, and things like an owner moving. So if you want to move back into your unit, or you have a close relative that wants to move back in, you can now move. You can terminate. You're going to have to pay 1 month's relocation fee and assist the resident to help assist the resident finding a new place. But you can't terminate. If you're going to withdraw it from the market, so if you're going to take a unit off the market, you can terminate. So there's an example where if you've got a 15-unit building and you're going to redevelop it, take it off the market, redevelop it, and then you can once it's ready to go back on, provided that you've actually done a substantial redevelopment where you get a new certificate of occupancy, it's no longer subject to it. So you can also terminate just for a substantial remodel. So if you're going to remodel just 1 unit and it's impractical for the resident to live there for at least 30 days, then that would be a justifiable reason to terminate a resident without doing a total redevelopment.
Okay. So there are some options, but it's just definitely much more stringent. Okay, so let's talk about all the. I know we kind of touched on it, but I want to kind of go in detail about these unintended consequences. Because I know there's just, allowing supply and demand to kind of dictate the pricing. And then there's, having laws like Assembly Bill 1482 to come in and kind of enforce it. But talk me through some of the unintended consequences that we may not be thinking about.
Yeah, these are going to be largely same things I hit on earlier. So, right, your unintended consequences over the long term is you limit resident mobility, right? So that's holds up units that would otherwise be available for new tenants. So it benefits incumbent renters, it harms future residents that are looking for a place, and it that all goes to limiting supply, right? So rent control is a short-term fix for a larger problem, especially in California, which we've got a limited supply of housing. This is a short-term sort of band-aid approach to trying to fix that when the real problem is more housing. Long term, this is actually going to do the opposite, right? So this is going to, we know from looking at other jurisdictions that have had rent control in place for a while, is actually going to limit the housing stock overall, and that just drives up prices. So you limit renter mobility, you incentivize landlords to either maximize their rents or you incentivize them to remove buildings from the rental market in order to escape the rent cap and the just cause. You increase rents for future residents, so you damage the affordability, and then you, as I mentioned earlier, you're sort of contributing to gentrification of neighborhoods and existing communities by new units are now going to demand a higher income resident than they otherwise would.
Right. So, I mean, this is almost gonna. I mean, I don't know. You just think about. I mean, California. I mean, it's gonna make it. I mean, just really unaffordable for. I mean, a young person. I mean, do you think that we'll see more people moving out of state?
Well, we already are.
Yeah.
Hard to say what impact this will have, but I'm sure it'll have an impact on sort of out-of-state investors and people that otherwise would invest in properties within California.
Right.
I think this is kind of writing on the wall for more to come. You know, legislation breeds more legislation, in my opinion. So a good example is Oregon implemented this exact bill, and sure enough, 11 months later, California's got the same bill, even a little tighter. So other states will follow, I'm sure. Often what happens in California often happens, we'll see it up in Washington, we'll see it in Colorado and elsewhere.
Wow. Wow. So it definitely could have a trickle down effect. So what does that mean for investors? What, start buying now so that, you could get your rents up and you'll be exempt?
Yeah, the counter argument is, this bill was negotiated in an attempt to remove some of the unknowns for investors. Is we know that every single year we've got tenant rights organizations that are putting new initiatives trying to drive even, if you ask tenant rights organizations about this bill, they'll tell you this is not enough, right? So they're not going to be satisfied with this, and they're going to continue to drive, whether it be at local markets or broader markets, initiatives that are even tighter than what we're seeing in this assembly bill.
Right. Wow. Yeah, this is, just being in this industry. I mean, the unintended consequences. I mean, you just think about, yeah, I just could see it having a lot of unintended consequences that, we're not even thinking about, just, blind spots. I'm definitely going to be following it closely, especially since, like you said, legislation breeds more legislation. So, yeah, definitely going to be following it closely.
Yeah, and there's some red tape in this bill in terms of managing a property today under this bill. So, for example, you've now got to, if you do qualify for one of the exemptions I touched on earlier, it's not as simple as the fact that you qualify. You've now got to put in your lease or give your resident notice that your property is exempt, or else you don't get the benefit of that. So little gotchas like that, where now it's up to you as the landlord to educate um, the resident that there's a law in place that says that certain properties are subject to rent cap, and oh, by the way, this one's exempt. If you don't tell them that, the property is no longer exempt, which is, it's in part absurd in my opinion, but it just adds to more fine print boilerplate that goes into a lease that we know residents will never read. But if you don't put it in there, you don't get to benefit from the exemption. For example, if you own a single family home, just the fact of owning a single family home doesn't make you exempt. You've got to own a single family home, and you've got to put a provision in your lease agreement that says, oh, by the way, this home is exempt from the specific civil code provisions. Same thing, the owner move-in exemption that I mentioned earlier, where if you own a property, you're renting it out, and your daughter just graduating from college, and you want her to move back into the property, you should otherwise be able to do this under the bill. But if you didn't put into your lease that you have the right to do that, you can't take advantage of the exemption. So little gotchas in there that I'll call repetitive gotchas
Yeah.
that property owners need to be aware of now. Management of the property. One of the other just administrative pieces is if you do have a tenant that's now in breach of the lease, whether they either failed to pay rent or they're in material breach, normally you would give them a 3-day pay or quit notice, or give them a cure or quit notice that says, hey, here's the breach. You got 3 days to cure it. You got 10 days to cure it, whatever the notice is. And if they fail to do it, you can then move to terminate the lease. Now, that is now just a precursor notice. So if they don't respond, now you've got to reserve a new notice that says, hey, I'm going to terminate the lease and there's no right to cure. So you've got to serve now 2 notices as a landlord in order to terminate. That just adds to administrative costs. And whenever you increase administrative costs like that, legal fees, it all works its way into higher rent amounts.
Right. Yeah, just something I just kind of thought about it just now. Like I could see in places like San Francisco, in LA, I could see there being much more subleasing activity. Just people, friends, and people in the network. Almost like never moving out of a place, just staying in it, and just subleasing everything to somebody.
Yeah, so as long as you've got a lease agreement that doesn't allow subleasing,
Okay.
your consent, a tenant can't just sublease your unit and escape these provisions. So if they sublease or sign the lease without your consent as a landlord and your lease doesn't allow them to do that, then that would be considered a material breach. So you could terminate the lease.
Okay. Good to know. Good to know, really, because I know that goes on a lot. Awesome. So we've got tons of questions. Keep shooting them our way. I mean, because this is, we're doing this for you guys. So we got tons of questions. Let me see what we have right here. Okay, we addressed that. Okay. Will this bill? What are your thoughts around how will this impact REIT and kind of like big Wall Street investors? Do you think it'll make them want to? How do you think this bill will impact those people that are a lot of them have tons of units? How do you think it'll impact those people?
I don't think this will have a material impact on what I'll call institutional investors. So my background is I spent 8 years working for a REIT, one of the largest single-family home real estate investment trust. So, this bill, in its sense, 7%, institutional investors aren't in the business of, as I mentioned earlier, kicking out good tenants. So, with a 7% cap, especially on single-family homes, you're not going to get truly underwater um, on a home unless you buy a home with an existing resident that is underwater. So, that's a good question. It would actually potentially impact investment in existing homes that are occupied. So, as an investor, and this is true whether I'm an individual investor, it would be a corporation or an institutional investor. But if a home is for sale that has an existing tenant and it is substantially in the market, I'm probably not going to be incentivized to buy that home because I can no longer there, depending on how on the market it is, I may never be able to get that home up to market as long as that tenancy is in place, if that makes sense.
Okay. Okay, we have another question that came in from Aaron. Are we to roll back rents if they were raised to say 10% between March 15th and now?
So yeah, if you raised it to 10%, if you've raised it to 10% after March 15th of 2019, then come January, or I shouldn't say 10%, if you've raised it more than the statutory amount under this bill after, sorry, after March 15th of 2019, then come January 1, the rents would have to be rolled back to an amount that would be compliant with the approximate 7% that's under this bill. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I did. Okay, this question is coming from Susan. I have a single family with a mother-in-law suite, 2 addresses. So is that property not exempt?
It's got 2 separate addresses. And so this property does exempt single-family homes or properties that have like in-law units and they're called accessory buildings that you're renting out. So if it's in that category and it's not owned by a corporation, then you will still maintain the exemption. If they're 2 truly separate addresses, you're probably still exempt because I categorize those as 2 alienable properties, which are exempt from this bill. And treat them both as like dwellings in essence.
Okay. Let's see. Let's see. So Susan needs a little bit more clarification on just cause. That she has a single family. So am I exempt on statewide rent cap? Or what about just cause? Can I still terminate the lease for lack of proper care and lack or late rent payments?
Yes. So if I heard that correctly, she owns a single family home.
Eight single family homes.
8 single family homes.
Yes.
So if each of those 8 homes are owned by her personally and not by an LLC or a corporation, or an LLC that's owned by a corporation, I should say, then they would be exempt from this bill, which means they're not subject to just cause and they're not subject to the rent cap.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. So she also said, let's see. Okay, what about how are the eviction laws impacted by 1482?
Well, the eviction laws themselves, well, a couple impacts. One is the notice issue I mentioned earlier. So if somebody doesn't pay their rent or is in breach of their lease today, the prerequisite for an eviction is you serve them with that single notice for 3 days. They rent or quit. They don't pay their rent in 3 days, you move to eviction. This adds a step where once they don't pay, then you got to serve them with another notice of terminating the lease without a right to cure, and then you can proceed to the eviction. Other than that, I don't know how this would, well, just cause impacts your right to eviction, right? So if somebody doesn't, in today's market without this bill, if somebody is in a 12-month lease and you give them a notice of non-renewal at the end of their 12 months and they don't move out, you can evict them. You can no longer do that with just cause.
Okay.
You're not in a single family home or a property that's exempt.
Okay, this next one comes from Ed. Is there any way that a tenant and landlord can just waive the cap if they want to?
No, this is non-waivable. So assuming you're subject to this, you cannot waive it.
Okay. He also said, between now and the 1st, we can still give out a termination of tenancy with the appropriate 60-day notice for a month-to-month tenant over a year. The only thing retro is the rent.
That is correct. That is correct. Just cause does not go into effect until January 1. The only thing that has effect is a rent increase that you've implemented after March 15th of 2019.
Okay, from Scott. What does the bill say about utilities?
What does the bill say about, I'm sorry, what?
Utilities?
Utilities?
Yes.
Yeah, this shouldn't impact utilities. The only impact to utilities would be potentially if you've included utilities as part of your rent, and then that overall rent is subject to the rent cap. But if utilities are a pass-through or residents are paying utilities in their own name, then that wouldn't be impacted by this bill.
Okay. Okay. Okay, this is from Susan. So just say we have a current contract in place. Does the terminology need to be revised to include the statewide rent control?
Potentially, yes. So if you have, say you've got an existing tenant in place on a single family home that is exempt from this bill. If it's an existing contract, it obviously doesn't have the disclosure language that notifies a resident that property is exempt from the rent cap and the just cause. And presumably it doesn't have language that allows you to do an owner move-in, whether it be yourself or a close relative. So what this bill requires you to do in order to afford yourself those protections would be to give that resident notice as of January 1, and then come July, any new leases that go out, you need to have that language built into the lease. Can't do it through a separate notice that's had part of the lease. I think that answers the question. But...
Yep. Okay, this is from Dennis. Do you expect those homes owned by a REIT or LLC with a board member to be dumped onto the market as a result?
No, I don't. Because as I mentioned earlier, if the institutional investor owned, by the way, institutional investors only own about 3% of the single family housing stock that's in the state of California. So it's a small number in the overall big picture. But existing properties that are owned by real estate investment trusts or institutional investors are going to be, they're not going to be so underwater that they can't maintain or keep up with market rents with this, 5 to 7% annual increase.
Mm-hmm.
But as with any rent control, there are ways for landlords to get out from underneath this, whether it be an institutional investor or an individual landlord, in terms of taking a home off the market. There are various other avenues that I think this all goes to the long-term negative impact of rent control. So I do think that if an institutional investor has a problematic tenant, or we shouldn't even talk about institutional investors because this is true for everybody. You're going to find a way to remove that tenant, and you're now going to be incentivized to do things that you otherwise wouldn't do in terms of renovations, not maximize the rent.
Okay. Let's see. We have maybe one more question. Okay. What if the tenant doesn't want to remodel? Will the tenant have any say? Will they have any say?
Generally, no. That's assuming that they're on a month-to-month lease and not part of their. So you can't just spring on a tenant 6 months into a 12-month term that, oh, by the way, we're going to do a substantial remodel and you're out. But a tenant, if it's a month-to-month tenancy and the landlord elects to do a substantial remodel, then provided they give the tenant the requisite notice when they're going to do it and when they have to be out, then that's justifiable on rules. Tenant doesn't get to decide. No, as you as a property owner can't improve the property.
Okay. Let me see. I think that just about does it in terms of questions. Giles, do you have any more to add about the Assembly bill?
No.
Any more to add?
If there's questions, we'll keep them coming after the webinar, and whether it's myself or anybody here at mine, we'd be happy to answer.
Awesome. To everybody that took their time out today, I want to say thank you. We will be following Assembly Bill 1482 very closely. If you have any questions, please go to mine.co, or you can email me directly. You can see my email right there. I'm Wendell, and I'm joined by Giles. So we're here for you. So that concludes everything. Everybody have a good rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks, Wendell.